With a record-setting achievement that has blown past $1 million on Kickstarter, Monte Cook Games' latest project, in collaboration with Deep Nerd Media, aims to bring the old Gods of Appalachia podcast to life on gaming tables with an RPG that takes players and GMs to an alternate take on the deep dark woods of Appalachia, where ancient, unknown horrors and entities, things older than we could ever imagine, come into contact and perhaps conflict with our lives, our friends, our families, and our communities. I recently had the distinct pleasure of speaking with lead designer on the project, Shanna Germain, and in this video she's going to invite us a bit behind the scenes as she talks about what we should expect from this game, discussing a few key design goals and ambitions, and we'll dive into how Old Gods of Appalachia RPG is a unique opportunity for a game to make the most out of its strengths as an auditory experience shared with friends around a table or on a screen. With Monte Cook Games celebrating their 10th anniversary this year, I was curious as to how the momentum and success of the Kickstarter has felt for the team and what it's like to look back on the journey so far.
Honestly, like there's this sense of surreality to it, of course. And then there's also this sense of like, I'm so happy for our team because like we're 10 years old this year, and like starting a successful RPG company is so hard and it's so much work. And like this team, you know, for the first 5 years, like we jokingly say that like none of us had any more free time than we could watch like a half an hour show a day, because it was so, it just took over our lives. And so it's really great to feel like, you know, that hard work and dedication is being rewarded. We have the most amazing team and they give everything. And, you know, we do our best to give back, right? We try to make sure we have a good working environment. We cover healthcare and retirement funds, and like that's really so important for creators, and to be a company that's sort of at the forefront of that is awesome. And so this feels like, I don't know, I hope the team's so proud because like it just feels like, I don't know, it's amazing. And of course it's the perfect combination of two sort of companies that have done the same thing, right? Because Steve and Cam at Old Gods of Appalachia have also worked. It's a labor of love, and so it feels like this kind of amazing, everything's just coming together there in this really great way. And you know, our fans, God, like the fact that they've just continued to support us and is just so, it's so meaningful. It just feels like the best reason to be a creator, for me anyway.
Like many wonderful moments of collaboration, Old Gods of Appalachia RPG came out of like minds finding an opportunity to combine their love of rich narrative experiences that take on the challenge of finding something new and unique.
Jordan, who runs Dread Singles, knew both of us and introduced us and said, hey, you know, these people who do this amazing podcast are looking to do an RPG, and these people who do RPGs like do these really cool narrative sort of lyrical RPGs. And I brought it to the team, and Tammy, who's on our team, grew up in that area of Appalachia, really close to where Old Gods of Appalachia takes place. And so she was like, I love that podcast, I can't believe, you know. And so it was kind of this, it just like so many things, right? It just kind of all came together in this wonderful way. We haven't done a lot of licenses. We really like to make our own stuff. And so I think it says a lot that like this was a license that caught our eye, because it's such a cool setting and a cool world, and there's just so much depth to it and so much to explore and such great stories to tell at the table. It's such an interesting time because we're starting to see stories being told that haven't been told before, particularly from that region, and told from people who are inside the experience, which is so different than being told from people who like sort of look in and often look down at those spaces. And so that's part of what appealed to us too, is it's such an inside story told, you know, in a way that's attempting to sort of break all the stereotypes and do really cool original stuff.
Old Gods of Appalachia RPG is set in an alternate version of the very real region of Appalachia, an area with a rich and difficult history, one that is complex and not always understood or talked about honestly. Like the podcast, MCG is approaching the game with a desire to be respectful and honest, so I asked Shanna about how the team is approaching the real and the fictitious, and the balance between the two.
So one thing that I think is really interesting is I also grew up, it turns out, in the Appalachian region of New York, which I did not know. I grew up in upstate, sort of near Ithaca. And so one of the funny things that happened was, as I started doing the research for this, I was like, you know, I was coming across all these sayings and these pronunciations pronunciations, and I was like, that's how I pronounce things. Those are sayings that I grew up with as a kid. And then when Tammy was like, well, where you grew up is part of Appalachia, I was like, oh, like I had no idea. So that's just the beginning of the kinds of things like that you become informed about, when you start exploring something that you've sort of only had in your periphery for a long time. So I think that, and it is really interesting, growing up, I did say Appalachia, like so many people. And of course, Tammy perfectly schooled me. She was like, no, I threw the Appalachia. And I was like, okay, I will remember that forever. That's beautiful. I love it. And so even the sort of language and the slogans and the idioms and stuff that I grew up with are different from sort of more, sort of different parts of Appalachia. So that's like, it's all varied. And so one of it is like, there's this verisimilitude, this sense of authenticity that comes from combining what's real with what people expect. Because if it's too real, but it breaks expectations too much, it doesn't feel real, right? So it's this really complicated sort of balance of combining all of those things. One of the great things about building it from a podcast is that everyone has lots of pronunciation stuff if they listen to that. And I think that also there's a way in which we can play around with that because of this sort of alternativeness of it, because it's not set exactly in Appalachia, as we know, because there's all these amazing monsters and weirdness and stuff. And so you get to play around a little bit and build on the foundations that are there to make new things, which is sort of one of my favorite things to do. We always use sensitivity readers. That's the whole other side of that. And in this in particular, it's all very entangled. And how do you do it with respect? And how do you build on a place that was built on in all these bad ways and all these difficult ways, and sort of honor all the aspects of that. And that's a thing that we're sort of just starting to figure out how to do that. And it's different with every single book and every product, because every story is different and every people is different and every culture is different and their experiences are different. And so it's important to us that we get sensitivity readers and get sensitivity editors who are from the area, who are from the specific, indigenous people from that area, rather than sort of general without experience. So it's a really complicated thing to do right, but our goal is always to do it right. And so we never know ahead of time kind of what that entails, but we will figure it out as we go, which is sort of how we do all those things. And thankfully we have a lot of resources, and we make sure we build in time to cover those aspects of things to get it as right as we possibly can.
Before meeting with Shanna, I asked the Infinite Construct community to chime in with any questions or curiosities they may have had about this upcoming game, and a common one, voiced by Danny Favell-Bjorn, concerned what this game was going to be about and what we should expect the themes to cover. The answer, as it turns out, was rather surprising and exciting.
That is an awesome question. It is the first question I ask myself whenever I'm designing a game. It's like, what do we do at the table? And for this one, I think the answer that, and this caveat that everything changes as we design, but the place that we're sort of starting is this idea that you're protecting what matters. And in this case, that's community and family and friends and the important sort of heritage and space and the things that, you hold dear. So there's a lot of protecting what matters. And then the other thing I think that is the big part of this is knowing the unknowable. So it's sort of a little bit of that idea of exploration, but it's in a more sense of that there are all these things out there that don't have names, or that that you can't understand and you can't process, but no, like learning just a little bit, or just being able to use a little bit of that magical element, or those just that little bit of lore. And so there's these two things, and they kind of combine into what we really wanted to do was really immerse the players and their characters into this land, into these entities, into these communities. And so for us, those are the two places that we're really starting, is sort of protection and sort of knowing, right, learning. And we the other sort of, I always have kind of pillars when I design a game, like things that I kind of check back against all the time to make sure that I'm on the right track. And so right now, the pillars for me are the sense of horror and hope and heart, like these three kind of things that are coming together because if you go too far horror, you lose the sort of the hope and the heart that is in these communities and in this land and these families. And if you go too far to the heart and the hope, you lose the horror. And all of those are really important. So those are kind of my touchstones as I build on protection and sort of knowing the unknowable.
As an RPG, there's always a question of challenges and what will be expected to overcome, and I imagine that was Zeus Legion's curiosity over how mere humans can stand against otherworldly horrors.
Yeah, that's such a great question, because I mean, I think it's really easy to fall back on combat in game design and in playing, right? Because there's this turn by turn, there's this mechanical, you roll dice. But Cypher System's so narrative that it allows a lot of space for creativity. And so, yeah, you know what? If you went up and you're like, I'm gonna use my miner's axe to, kill this creature of the inner dark, it's like, oh, you're so in trouble. But so I think what it does is it actually moves you away from that into these creative things. You want to make a bargain? Like, what kind of bargain? What do you have to give up to protect your land, to protect your family? What are you going to sacrifice? Like, sacrifice is a big part of this too. So, what smart way are you going to gather your community? Are you going to bring other forces? Are you going to do other things? Because you know that going head to head in combat with any one of these entities is going to end poorly for you. And so I think that, like, one of the great things, and particularly with the characters that you're able to build, a lot of the skills and abilities are going to be about your ability to, like, move things just a little bit as opposed to sort of taking them out, right? Can I move this entity so that I have a safe pathway for my family through here? Can we, make a bargain where we have to give up this, but we gain this other thing? And so a lot of what's built into the character abilities will be really encouraging that kind of creative interaction, that creative discovery. Even things like not being noticed is going to probably be pretty important, and things like sussing out some things' motivations if you possibly can. Plus there's ciphers, which are so much fun and give you, like, these really cool weird opportunities to, like, capture something in a mirror for 24 hours, so you can go and do, and then of course it's going to break out and you'll have to figure out what to do at that point. And we also did this, I'm working on this really cool thing of artifacts, where in the Cypher system, artifacts just deplete. They stop working for whatever reason and they lose their power. But here, the way that I think we're going to go is that all artifacts are the magical power of them are given to them by some entity. At some point, that entity is going to sort of call it back, and so your artifact comes due, which means that it stops working unless you're willing to sacrifice something to keep it going. And so the sacrifice will be different depending on where or who that power comes from. And so the players will get an opportunity to choose, do I want to keep this really cool whatever I have that does amazing things and give something up that matters to my character so deeply, or do something that is out of my character's sort of natural space? Or am I just gonna let it go? And so I'm very excited about that, because I think it's really narrative and fun, and people fall in love with the artifacts that they get because they're so cool. They have names, and so it'll hopefully be a really hard decision for characters.
What stood out to me the most in my discussion with Shanna was how much of the design process was about making the most of the Cypher system's strengths and finding ways for it to adapt to this setting. This isn't merely about just taking the Cypher system as we know it in the CSR or in other games and using that to just play in the setting, but it's a game that's embracing how the Cypher system can be molded and adapted to fit the needs of this particular setting, and not just as a horror setting, but uniquely the horror elements that old Gods of Appalachia has come to be loved for in its podcast.
Something that I've been mulling a lot on as I think about the game, right? Because, Predation, we gave people companions, and I think it was just last year I did the fairy tale book where there's curses, and so you can get cursed and all these kinds of cool things. And so there will be something for this game, and I have some ideas kind of floating around. I think it's deeply about connecting to the community as opposed to sort of combat-y or anything else like that, but I don't really know yet. It's one of those things where that stuff is so woven together for me that it often comes out of some small discovery as I'm designing, and so I suspect that will be the case. Often too, play tests are like, I mean, for example, when we first started playtesting the companions of Predation, they were so broken. Like, they totally didn't work. They were a pain in the ass. Like, nobody knew what like, they were running all over, but not in a good way. It was just a disaster. And so sometimes I have this, like, what I think is this amazing idea, and then I bring it to our playtester table, and like, it just all blows up. So I have ideas. They will go through the playtesting and see if any of them survive. And after that, but I do think that there's something about sacrifice and community, and like that it's all tied into that in ways that I think are really interesting and unique to this setting. And so what we, the goal will be to deepen those ties in a really interesting, at the table kind of way. But I don't yet know what that's going to be.
Monte Cook Games has made it a tradition to include lists of books and media that inspired them during the design process, and this can be found in almost all of their products, with a bibliography that allows players and game masters to both get inspired by a genre and a theme and a tone, but also get into the headspace of the vision of the game that the team sets out to make.
You're right, the main source for the book is the podcast, right? And Cam and Steve are my sources for resources, because they like, if I bring a nonfiction book to them and say, here, they can say, not that one, right? Or yes, that one. And so that's still a process that I'm deeply ingrained in, is like, reading as much nonfiction as I can. And Tammy gave me this amazing list of nonfiction books to like read through. And a lot of them are sort of supernaturally themed. And one of the really interesting things I think that makes a really cool confluence is that, obviously the podcast is auditory, and like that region has so much oral storytelling and oral and musical traditions. And so there's all this stuff that has never been written, that has never made it to the page. And with the internet, there's actually some of that is being written down, and people are telling their stories. And so there's a ton of stuff on the internet. There's some really interesting books. We'll definitely do a bibliography for this one, because I think it's going to be really important, especially on the nonfiction side. We want, I mean, it's such a big learning curve for so many people, including things like, we had this big discussion with Steve and Cam that was so great about the difference between sort of people's names when they're from kind of the Appalachia that we're talking about, which is sort of the hills and the hollers Appalachia, versus sort of city Appalachia, and how those names alone are really different. And and also staying away from stereotypical names and what the stereotypes are like. And so there's such a big learning curve that we are making a huge bibliography. And I'm also reading a ton of fiction, which is mostly authors from the area doing horror fiction. So that's my specific list right now. I just finished The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. And like, most of these are set in the region, and but they're not like, because Old Gods of Appalachia is so unique, like there's like threads that extend out into these things I'm reading, but of course none of them match up, right? Which is great, because it's just full of ideas. Caitlin Kiernan also wrote a bunch of stuff that I think has some really interesting stuff. Sherry Priest has written a ton. The Crooked Man is set in Appalachia, which, so if people are doing comics, Southern Gods by John Horner Jacobs. I haven't read yet Every Bone a Prayer. So I have a whole list of things that I'm digging into that, and some of them all touch on Appalachia or the ghost stories of the region in different ways. And there's a lot of stuff out there which I didn't realize until I sort of started looking and delving into it. There's also some movies, but most of them are not very good and not very true to sort of the region, so I won't recommend them, the ones that I watched so far.
On paper, we might directly understand the horror elements that go into being in the woods alone at night or encountering a ghostly apparition on the road. Key to the podcast as well as the game, however, is fine-tuning that horror to hit us in a particular way. It's not just about scary imagery and the fear of character death, but something more, perhaps something we can't fully understand.
Like so many things, using a phrase like eldritch horror is a shortcut to the place where you want to end up, right? Like, because it kind of it evokes a certain semblance of things, but part of that is also, racism and a lot of other things that we definitely are not interested in portraying, at least not in any way that's positive. So I think that the real sort of shared element there is that idea of the unknowable, of the things that are older than humanity, that are inexplicable, and also that like don't care about humanity in a sort of, there is no evil intent among these things because they're way older and way bigger, and like, you know, that's not like putting, like, it's not humanocentric horror, which I think is a big part of it. So much of our horror is about, oh, these things want to, you know, inflict something on humans, and the truth is that these things are so big and so old and so ancient that we're sort of just a means to an end in many ways, and there isn't, you know, there is just power there. And so I think that's a lot of what that kind of element contains. But really it's so much of the unknowable, right? The unknowable is so scary and so fascinating, and there's just so much hidden. And it makes me think of, like, I was just talking to someone and they were saying that I'm going to get my numbers wrong here, but there's like 50,000 known species of spiders and another 30,000 or something that we've never discovered. Like, and that kind of is how I feel about it. I feel that way about this kind of horror. Like, there's all these things that we know of, and then under and around that, there's just all this stuff that's been undiscovered. Sorry for the mention of creepy crawlies.
The spirit of tuning the game to meet the nuances of its setting and its brand of horror isn't just flavor either. It expands to the math and stats that we'll be playing with, which Shanna and the team are aiming to use not just to have difficulty numbers to roll dice against, but rather frameworks to help define and guide the storytelling as it reaches climactic and interesting moments.
I think one of the things that people don't talk about in RPGs very often that actually is so unique and so wonderful about this setting and this experience is that it's very auditory. Like, the lyricism, the lushness, this idea of like being able to hear and like, it's just very sensory, right? You can hear and see and smell, and like, of course we're all trying to do that in RPGs in the theater of the mind. That's a big goal. But because of sort of the culture of oral tradition and the culture of music and the culture of sort of, you know, being in the outdoors in a way that has a really unique sound and sensibility, I think that there's a lot to bring to the table in that way, in this sort of really sensory way. And one of the things I love is, you know, we just hit a stretch goal where Cam and Steve from Old Gods of Appalachia are gonna do like descriptions and sounds and all kinds of great stuff that you can bring to the table. And I think that's really so neat, especially in a game where maybe lots of people haven't experienced that, right? They don't know what the forest sounds like at night in that particular area, or what someone from the area sounds like. We were talking before about accents and that kind of stuff. And like, I think there's a real fear of it, you know, at least for many of us, of putting on an accent because we're going to screw it up, or we're going to sound, you know, like we're being somehow derogatory, or all these other things. And so by being able to hear the truth of that space, I think it really opens up players in a way that they can kind of immerse in it. And I just love that so much. The setting, boy, it has so much opportunity to do things that have never been done, which is something that really appeals to me as a game designer, because you have sort of, again, like it comes back to pillars. You have these pillars of what's there, what they've already created. They've got the inner dark and the green, and you know, all these sort of creatures and ancient bargains that have been made, and you know, this idea that you can't even know what those things want. And so there's this whole setting where you can just make so much cool stuff inside it, because it's like these parameters are set, but they're really wide open, and it's all about sort of the sensibility and the aesthetics, and the weirdness, and those really just allow you to do anything. And so I think, you know, some of the things, obviously there's tons of stuff in the podcast already, like these are really great creatures and entities, and you know, one of the things that we wrote up was the hounds, which are these multi-legged, really long-tongued, really bizarre, wonderful mouthed, like, oh, I just love them so much. And so it is a challenge to take this really lush, lyrical kind of creature entity and break it down into statistics without losing that just great kind of storytelling joy. And so that's one of the things that will be it's sort of my passion to do lyricism and poetry in the things that I write. And so I really love the fact that I get to kind of bring those to the page and try to keep that sense of cool weirdness. And of course our artists help so much because they're really great at that.
With such an emphasis on language and beings that are difficult to quantify by any stretch of the human imagination, I was curious about how the team is approaching the assigning of difficulty numbers and numerical challenges to creatures that are, by design, undefinable and perhaps ultimately unknowable.
Yeah, that is such a valid question. And I think there's a bunch of parts of it. Like one part of this is teaching GMs how to run a game that isn't where they aren't saying, okay, this creature's got 12 health, you gotta roll blah blah, right? Like where they're really evoking the entity and putting it right at the table, and kind of like hiding the stats behind the language and all that kind of stuff. And so part of it, there will definitely be a GM section about like how to GM this kind of thing in a way that is really evocative and creates a scene and doesn't rely on the numbers in that way. And so and I think that too, there's probably I haven't figured this part out yet, but I think there's some tips for the players too on how to describe what their characters are doing in a way that, again, is really less about the numbers and more about their actions. And we try to do that in the language of their abilities and that kind of stuff. But, it's sort of habit sometimes to just be like, I've got a 9 in this and I rolled up, right? Like where you're talking about mechanics. And, there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody plays differently. But we want to offer guidance for people who do want to do this real experience. And then taking the numbers is so much to me about, like when I sort of close my eyes and think about what this creature moves like and acts like and smells like and how smart they are and what they do in their free time. I know that's wild, but like, I have a real problem with like, oh, I'm just an ogre and I stand here at the dungeon, like waiting for you to come and beat me up. And I don't know what I eat down here because there's no food, like that whole like lack of ecosystem, like just breaks my world building brain in a bad way. And so when I think about an entity and I think, okay, like what are they? What do they do? What are their motivations? What are their goals? As I'm closing my eyes, like imagining this, then I start like being able to assign numerical values to that in a way that's sort of organic, I think. And so like, how scary are they? How fast are they? How smart are they? Like, what can they do besides sort of defend or attack? Like how, and that's where we get into places like the interactions that we have and like use. And I think that also we're going to add a thing to the creatures for this that's like connection, because connection to community is so important. And so like I was watching the video you did before where you were like, and this ghost is connected to, the ghostly hitchhiker is connected to the, because I was like, yes, that's exactly what we're doing. Like you've got it. She's totally spot on. I was just like delighted. So yeah, I think we're gonna do like this possible connections where you can be like, here's how to take this entity, this creature, or this NPC, and bring them right into the family of the player characters in really cool and interesting ways. And so, you don't have to, again, like it's all optional, but I think that every time you can like add another connecting thread back to the sort of the goals of the play at the table, I think it continues to deepen that. One of the things I love about parameters is that it enforces creativity in interesting ways. Like I was just thinking as you're talking about, so like in We're All Mad Here, which is the fairy tale thing I did, like death is an NPC. And I was like, how do we make it so that death can't die? And so like we just put eternal under like death, or, under health. And then the other one that we had was the black dogs, which are sort of ghostly dogs from fairy tales and all kinds of folklore. And we had to give them a health so people could kill them. But I wanted to discourage that. And so what we did was we made it so that if you do kill a black dog, they like haunt you and your character for a really long time, and they make you sad all the time, and they give you despair and depression. And like I thought, that's like you're basically working within the parameters of like the expectations of Cypher System to move toward this interesting narrative where players still have a choice. They can make a choice to do whatever they want, but they understand that there are interesting ramifications and repercussions for that. So I suspect we'll see a lot of that in this game too, right? Where everything like that has an effect, and sometimes you know what that is and you make that choice, and sometimes you may not, and now you have to live with choices like the rest of us humans who make bad choices and to deal with it.
Old Gods of Appalachia RPG will be a complete game from cover to cover. It and the expanded material that is being unlocked through stretch goals aims to deliver us a tome of wonderful source material and rules to have a rich, engaging game that explores all of the themes discussed in this video. But as a Cypher System game, Old Gods of Appalachia RPG has another advantage, that of existing in an ecosystem of compatible products that allows players and GMs a set of tools to tweak and customize the experience even further. I asked Shanna what she thought might be some great MCG books that would pair well with Old Gods of Appalachia RPG to expand and diversify the already complete and lush experience that we'll be getting when the books start shipping.
I think one of the things is it depends on what kind of game you're aiming for, right? So We're All Mad Here has tons of ciphers and creatures that are based in fairy tale and folklore, and a lot of Appalachia stuff is also fairy tale and folklore. So I think you could, if you really wanted to sort of up the oral tradition, up the sort of, particularly like there's a lot of, I think, like Scottish and Irish sort of influence, and so you could bring that in. And then if you wanted to up the like horror, you could use Stay Alive and bring like the horror escalation in, which would be really interesting. And I think you could break the system a little bit, and I don't say break in a bad way, but you could go more science fantasy and bring in some weird sort of science elements if you wanted to, particularly because it's mostly set in like the 1920s and 30s. You could get some sort of early, weird, cool, funky sci-fi elements in there if you wanted to. Yeah, there is some, there is some, that idea of unknowable that I think kind of overlaps with the two too. So yeah, I think depending on the sort of feel and atmosphere you want to go with, you could probably pick almost anything, and go there, which I think is really like it gives you so much flexibility as a GM, but I know it can also be overwhelming if you are like, what? So yeah, this book will have everything you need. You don't need to go further if you find that to be, like, no, thank you, too much. So yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to go with it, and I think I'll probably include a section that talks about that, right? You want to go more horror, you want to go, you can use this, you can use that, because we're also include a section of like, if you want to move this into something more modern, like the podcast is mostly set in those early 1900 eras, but there's some modern stuff, and so we'll talk a little bit about how to move things forward if you want to, and right, we want GMs and players to play the game that they want to play, and so we can give them ways to do that. That's hopefully a thing that we can put in there.
My time with Shanna gave me a wonderful insight into the making of this game, and it has gotten me even more excited to see it in print when it starts shipping. Thoughtful, original narrative experiences at the table have been what has made MCG so beloved for the rich community of fans who keep coming back. And I not only think that Old Gods of Appalachia RPG will continue that tradition, but will also bring something truly unique and memorable to the table. This is a horror game with a deep and fantastic setting created by a very special podcast with an attention to genre and narrative and thematic elements that center powerful, haunting stories. Bringing this into a collaborative space with players around a table or on a screen, to me, is going to be nothing short of profound, and I can't wait to start weaving stories, building characters, and encountering the unknown in the dark depths of an alternate Appalachia. I'd like to thank Shanna for her time and for sharing what is so exciting about this upcoming game. I hope you've enjoyed this look into what's coming to our tables in the near future with Old Gods of Appalachia RPG. If you'd like to support more videos and productions like this one and help make this content even better, consider supporting the Infinite Construct through Patreon. Links are below. For more content about Old Gods of Appalachia RPG, as well as Numenera, Cypher System, and other TTRPG gaming products, be sure to give a like, share, and subscribe to the Infinite Construct.